In March of 1970, Walter Hutchinson stood at the back row of the Grange Hall on the corner of Route 14 and Old Cemetery Road in Mapleton Township, Sumner County, Iowa, and watched the well auction begin without him. There were 47 men in that hall. Every one of them owned a working well on a working farm. Every one of them had come that night to sell. The Northern Iowa Coal and Industrial Company had been buying water rights across the valley since the previous October at $40 a foot of certified depth, cash on the barrelhead, payable inside 30 days, for a 120-foot well that came to $4,800. For a 180-foot well, it came to $7,200. The company's landman, a thin, nervous fellow in a gray worsted suit, had set up at the front table with a fountain pen and a stack of pre-printed contracts and a brown leather satchel that smelled of pipe tobacco and railroad money. Harlan Denton had the auction paddle in his right hand and a wide grin on his clean-shaven face. And he did most of the talking. Harlan was 44 years old, stocky, neatly combed, in tan slacks and a red and cream plaid button-down under a dark wool coat. He owned 180 acres east of Walter's line. He had taken the company's offer on his own well 3 days earlier, $5,640 for a 141-foot well. And now he was working the room. "Come on, Walter," Harlan called, loud enough for the back row to turn its head. $40 a foot. 40. You've got what, a 154-foot well out there on the Hutchinson place? That's $6,160. Cash, in your hand, by April. A man your age don't see that kind of money come knocking but the once. Walter Hutchinson stood at the back row and said nothing. He was 67 years old. He held his father's 1934 hand-drawn aquifer map folded in quarters in his right hand. His left hand rested on the back of an empty wooden chair. His pioneer seed corn ball cap was pushed back half an inch on his silver-white hair. His pale blue eyes behind the silver wire-rimmed glasses were on the front table, not on Harlan. "A dry hole is a dry hole, you old fool," Harlan said, turning toward him fully now, paddle still raised. "And a wet one's worth $40 a foot. You going to stand there and let the rest of us cash out while you piss into the wind?" A few of the men laughed. Most did not. Most of them had farmed beside Walter Hutchinson for 40 years and knew the silence on him meant something they would learn later. Walter folded the map a fourth time and slid it into his chest pocket. He nodded once to the chairman of the Grange. He turned and walked out of the hall without speaking. His black and white border collie Annie was waiting in the bed of the 1962 Ford F-100 in the gravel lot, and she stood when she saw him come down the steps, and she did not bark. That was turning point one. The auction did $264,300 in well sales that night across 39 separate parcels. Walter Hutchinson's name was not on any of them. He drove home on Route 14 with the map in his pocket and the dog at his shoulder, and he did not turn the radio on. The map had been drawn by his father, Edgar Hutchinson, in the spring of 1934. Edgar had walked the 280 acres on foot for 9 consecutive Sundays after church, with a forked peachwood dowsing rod in his hands and a U.S. Geological Survey contour sheet folded in his coat pocket, and he had penciled a single oblong shape across the back 40 of the property with the words "Deep Cold, 220 feet, Sweet," written inside it in his careful school teacher hand. The map had hung on a nail in the milkhouse wall for 36 years. Walter had taken it down on a Tuesday in February and folded it into quarters and put it in his pocket and not told a soul. He had $940 of his own money in a mason jar buried under the third floorboard of the back porch. He had a 1948 Pearson rotary well rig in the South machine shed, bought used in 1953 from a retiring driller in Cedar County for $300. And he had spent the winter rebuilding the gearbox and the mud pump on a coffee can full of kerosene and a $14 set of replacement seals from the Ace Hardware in Mapleton. The rig still ran. The rig was 22 years old, and it still ran. He had also kept his father's notebook. Edgar Hutchinson had filled 6 identical hard-bound green ledger books between 1923 and 1956, and the third of those, labeled Water and Wells, Sumner County, 1928 to 1942. In fading copperplate, sat on the kitchen shelf above the stove with a brown rubber band around its middle. Edgar had measured the static water table at 6 different points across the property every March from 1928 to 1942, and had written the numbers in a careful column down the left margin of every page. Walter had read the columns 30 times since February. He could have recited the numbers in his sleep. The pencil line on the map was not a guess. The pencil line was a 14-year average. In April of 1970, Walter Hutchinson started the first well. He sunk it on the southwest pasture, 60 yards in from the road, on ground his father had not marked, because here he wanted to prove something to himself before he committed to the map. The Pearson chugged for 11 days. He went down 168 feet and brought up nothing but dry shale and a thin yellow clay that smelled of nothing at all. He pulled the bit. He capped the hole with a tin lid weighted by a fieldstone. He sat on the tailgate of the F-100 with Annie at his boots and ate a cold biscuit and drank water from a glass canning jar and said nothing. A dry hole is a dry hole. That was the spring Harlan Denton bought a brand-new 1970 Chevrolet Impala for $3,460 cash. With the proceeds of his well sale, drove it down the gravel road past Walter's gate and laid on the horn for 200 yards. Walter was at the fence with a roll of barbed wire. He did not look up. Annie did not move from his boot. In July of 1970, Walter Hutchinson started the second well. He sunk it on the east cornfield, 40 yards in from the property line, on ground his father had not marked either, because he was a careful man and he wanted to be sure the map was right before he laid the rig in the back 40. The Pearson chugged for 14 days through 30-degree summer heat that had every other thermometer in Mapleton Township pinned at 96. He went down 191 feet and brought up nothing but dry shale and a thin gray clay and a single damp stripe at 187 feet that did not produce a cup of water in 48 hours. He pulled the bit. He capped the hole with a second tin lid. He walked back to the house, through the corn rows, and washed his hands at the pump and ate his supper and said nothing. That was the summer the Northern Iowa Coal and Industrial Company sunk its first industrial intake well 3 miles south of the Hutchinson place. The intake went down 380 feet. Its discharge ran at 2,200 gallons per minute, 24 hours a day. By August, the static water table across the valley had dropped 14 feet. Nobody noticed yet. The neighbors still had water in their bought-out wells because the company had not yet started pumping at full capacity. The company was waiting on its second permit, 2 dry holes. $940 of Walter Hutchinson's money was now $612. The Pearson needed a new mud line. Annie was 8 years old, and her muzzle was going gray at the edges. The old man took the map out of his chest pocket and unfolded it on the kitchen table under the kerosene lamp. And he sat with his pale blue eyes on his father's pencil line for a long time. He sunk the third well in May of 1971 on the back 40, exactly where the pencil line said to sink it. He chugged the Pearson for 9 days. He went down 218 feet through shale and gray clay and a band of fractured limestone that the bit ate through at 4 feet a day. At 220 feet on the morning of June 4th, 1971, the cuttings came up wet. At 221 feet, the cuttings came up cold. At 223 feet, water rose in the casing pipe at 41 gallons per minute, sweet and cold and steady, and it rose over the lip of the casing, and it ran across the disturbed earth in a thin, clear sheet, and it pooled around Walter Hutchinson's scuffed brown work boots, and it kept rising. That was turning point 2. There were no witnesses. The collie sat at his boots with the cold water running over her white front paws, and she did not move. The wind moved across the back 40 and bent the prairie grass flat. The old man took off his pioneer seed corn ball cap and held it in his right hand and stood there for a full minute and said nothing aloud. Then he put the cap back on. Then he capped the wellhead and walked back to the machine shed and pulled the seal stock he had cut over the winter and began the slow, careful work of finishing what his father's pencil had started 37 years earlier. If this story is finding you tonight, take a moment to press the like button below. It helps stories like this find the men who still know what waiting looks like. He poured the cistern in 3 pours across the summer of 1971 and the spring of 1972. The cistern was a rectangular pad of reinforced concrete sunk 4 feet into the back 40 soil, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, 6 feet deep, with a poured-in 3-inch galvanized inlet from the wellhead and a brass spigot set into a 4-inch concrete pipe at the south face. The total volume was 4,300 gallons. The cost in materials was $387. He laded himself with 2 bags of Portland cement at a time hauled in the bed of the F-100 from the Ace Hardware in Mapleton. He poured the lid in October of 1972 after the harvest, with a 1/4-inch rebar grid and a hinged steel access plate scavenged from a 1958 Massey Harris combine that had gone to salvage in 1969. In April of 1973, he laid 740 feet of buried galvanized line from the cistern down a 2-degree gravity grade to a 60-gallon livestock watering trough, set on a concrete pad at the property line on the east fence, where his pasture met Harlan Denton's 180 acres. He set a brass shut-off valve at the trough end, 6 inches above the soil. He filled the trough on the afternoon of April 14, 1973, and watched the water come down the line at a steady 3 gallons a minute, cold enough to fog the inside of the galvanized pipe. And then he closed the shut-off valve and walked back to the house. He did not tell a soul. He did not advertise the well. He did not put a sign at the road. He did not stop at the Grange Hall. He filled his own house cistern from the new well in the summer of 1973, and let the old 154-foot well at the homestead go on producing the 4 gallons a minute it had always produced, and he did not change one visible thing about the Hutchinson place that any neighbor driving past on Route 14 could see. The Northern Iowa Coal and Industrial Company opened its second intake well in August of 1973. Combined discharge across the valley reached 5,100 gallons per minute. The static water table dropped another 19 feet that autumn. By the end of 1973, the bought-out wells along Route 14 were producing at 70% of their 1969 yield, and 3 of them, the Pemberton Place, the Brockenshaw Place, the Tibbetts Place, had begun to draw sand at the pump head. The men in those farms shrugged. The company sent water trucks for the first 6 months at no charge as a contractual courtesy. In 1974, the rains came short. The county-wide rainfall total for the year was 22.4 inches against a 30-year average of 31.8 inches. The corn yield in Sumner County dropped from 142 bushels per acre in 1973 to 109 bushels per acre in 1974. Walter Hutchinson's own corn, irrigated quietly off the cistern in the worst 3 weeks of August through a 3/4-inch hand-laid garden line, he ran 90 feet to the south end of his sweet corn patch, pulled 138 bushels per acre. He sold his crop at the Mapleton Co-op at $3.04 a bushel and put the money in the same mason jar under the same floorboard and said nothing about the cistern to the man at the scale. In 1975, the rains came short again. The county-wide total was 19.7 inches. 5 farms in the township switched to dryland sorghum. 2 farms went into FHA receivership. The Northern Iowa Coal and Industrial Company opened its third intake well in June, and the combined discharge reached 7,400 gallons per minute, and a man from the state of Iowa Department of Natural Resources came up Walter Hutchinson's lane in a green Plymouth on a Tuesday afternoon in July, and asked him whether he had a well permit on file for any new construction since 1969. Walter said he did not. The man asked whether he had drilled any new wells. Walter said he had drilled 3. The man wrote that down on a clipboard. Then the man looked at Walter for a long moment and said, "Mr. Hutchinson, the company that holds the rights you didn't sell is pumping your aquifer dry. I would not advertise the 3rd well if I were you. I would not put a sign at the road. I would file the paperwork, and I would let it sit." Then the man got back into the green Plymouth and drove away. Walter Hutchinson filed the paperwork in the county recorder's office in Mapleton on the following Monday morning, paid the $11 fee, and walked out without speaking to anyone in the corridor. In 1976, the drought came hard. The county-wide rainfall total was 14.1 inches, the lowest since the records began in 1898. By July, the static water table along Route 14 was 47 feet below its 1969 level. The bought-out wells along the valley floor had begun to fail one after another, 3 a week, then 5 a week, then 7. The company's water trucks stopped coming. The contracts had specified 6 months of courtesy water for any well that ceased production due to industrial drawdown, and the language had quietly been renegotiated in 1974 to exclude drought as a contributing factor. The company's lawyers were polite. The company's lawyers were also 320 miles away in Des Moines. That was the summer Harlan Denton's own well went dry. It had been a 141-foot well producing 18 gallons per minute when he sold it to the company in February of 1970. He had used it for 71 months of courtesy water. On the morning of July 18th, 1976, the pump came up dry. He primed it. It came up dry again. He let it sit 4 hours. He primed it a third time. He pulled the line and lowered a tape into the casing and read 152 feet of dry shale. That was turning point 2 for Harlan Denton. He stood at his own wellhead on his own 180 acres on the afternoon of July 18th, 1976, with his hat in his hand, and he did not say anything aloud. He stood there for the better part of half an hour. He looked at the dry hole. He looked at the dry corn beyond the wellhead. He looked at the dry sky. The neighbor across the line, a man named Russell Cutler, was setting a fence post 80 yards away and saw the whole thing. Russell Cutler did not call out. He set his post. He walked back to his truck. He did not mention it at the Grange Hall that month or the next, but he saw it, and it stayed with him. Harlan Denton drove to Mapleton that evening and bought a 300-gallon stock tank from the co-op for $84. He drove it to the municipal water tower in town and paid 11 cents a gallon to fill it from the public hydrant. He hauled 300 gallons home. The tank was empty in 3 days. He bought a second tank. He bought a third. By September of 1976, he had spent $1,140 on hauled water for 180 acres of livestock and house use, and the dryland corn on the east end of his farm had burned to brown stubble in the field. Walter Hutchinson's corn stood 8 feet tall on the back 40 in September of 1976. Walter Hutchinson's livestock trough at the east fence was full and cold. Walter Hutchinson did not open the gate to the trough. The trough sat on Walter Hutchinson's land. The water in it was Walter Hutchinson's water. Harlan Denton drove past the trough 4 times a week on his way to the municipal hydrant in Mapleton, and he saw the water sitting in it, and he said nothing. In 1977, the drought came worse. The county-wide rainfall total was 12.8 inches. By August, the static water table along Route 14 was 62 feet below its 1969 level. The bought-out wells had failed in clusters now, 11 on the Pemberton stretch, 9 on the Brockenshaw stretch, 6 on the South Road below Mapleton. The men were hauling from the municipal hydrant at 11 cents a gallon, and the line at the hydrant began at 4 in the morning and did not clear until after dark. The pavement on Route 14 was rutted with the weight of stock tank water moved every week by every farm in the county. 16 of the 39 farms that had sold their wells to the Northern Iowa Coal and Industrial Company in March of 1970 had been listed at the Federal Land Bank that summer. The company had moved its industrial operation 90 miles east into Black Hawk County in February. The intake wells along the Sumner County Valley floor had been capped and abandoned. The company's local field office in Mapleton had closed in March. The phone at the company number in Des Moines rang and was not answered. In May of 1978, the rains came short again at 18.2 inches. By August, Walter Hutchinson was the only working farm on the 8-mile stretch of Route 14 between Mapleton and the county line that was still pulling its own irrigation off its own well. He told no one. Annie was 16 years old by then, going slow, but she still walked the back 40 with him at sunset, and the brass spigot at the cistern still ran cold. The strangers came first. A man from a neighboring township drove up the lane in October of 1978 in a battered 1964 Chevrolet pickup with two empty 55-gallon drums in the bed and asked, hat in his hand, whether the old man had any water he could spare for a sick milk cow. Walter Hutchinson looked at him. Walter Hutchinson opened the gate. Walter Hutchinson said, "Fill the drums at the trough. Don't bother to thank me. Tell anyone who needs it the same trough is here." He charged the stranger nothing. By the end of November 1978, 16 strangers had filled drums at Walter Hutchinson's east fence trough, and not one of them had been turned away, and not one of them had paid a cent. Annie had watched them all from the running board of the F-100 and had not barked at any of them. In June of 1979, the dust came up on Route 14. By June 14, 1979, the line of pickup trucks coming up Walter Hutchinson's lane was 7 deep most afternoons. They were no longer strangers. They were neighbors. They were Brockenshaw. They were Pemberton. They were Tibbetts. They were Russell Cutler. They were the men who had been at the Grange Hall on the night of March 11, 1970, and had sold their wells for $40 a foot and laughed at Walter Hutchinson's dry hole. Harlan Denton came up the lane on the afternoon of June 22, 1979, in a 1971 Ford F-250 with two empty 220-gallon stock tanks in the bed. And he stopped at the gate, and he sat in the cab for a moment with his hat off. And then he got out and walked the last 30 yards to where Walter Hutchinson was standing at the cistern beside the brass spigot. Walter was 76 years old by then. He was thinner than he had been in 1970. He still held his father's 1934 aquifer map, folded in quarters in his right hand. Annie was at his boots. She was 17 years old and she was nearly blind, but she stood when Harlan Denton came up the gravel. Harlan Denton said, "Walter, I need water. The herd's been on hauled water 7 months. I can't keep doing it. I'm asking what your price is." Walter Hutchinson looked at him. Walter Hutchinson looked at the map in his right hand. Walter Hutchinson opened the map for the first time in 9 years and laid it on the concrete lid of the cistern. On the back of the map, his father, Edgar Hutchinson, had written, in the same careful school teacher hand, in pencil, in the spring of 1934. "Water that comes up cold belongs to whoever needs it. Fair price is 4 cents a gallon. Anything more is theft. Anything less is pride." Walter Hutchinson said, "4 cents a gallon, Harlan, same as I'm charging the rest of them, same as my father wrote down in 1934. Pull your tanks up to the trough." That was turning point 3 for Walter Hutchinson. He did not raise his voice. He did not refer to the night at the Grange Hall. He did not refer to the Impala or the horn or the dry hole or the 1970 paddle in Harlan's hand. He turned the brass spigot and let the water run, and the water ran cold. Harlan Denton stood at the trough while his tanks filled, and he watched the water run. He watched it for a long time. When the second tank was 3/4 full, he turned to Walter Hutchinson, and his hat was in both his hands, and his face was the color of dry shale, and he said, "I had that wrong, Walter. I had it wrong all the way through." Walter Hutchinson said, "I know you did, Harlan. So did I. Twice, before the third hole came in. A man gets to be wrong twice on the way to right. We'll call it square." That was turning point 3 for Harlan Denton. he paid Walter Hutchinson $17.60 in cash for the 440 gallons in his tanks. He drove the F-250 down the lane with the dust rising behind him. And at the bottom of the lane, he stopped the truck, and he got out, and he stood at the gate for a full minute and looked back up the rise to where Walter Hutchinson was still standing at the cistern. Then he got back in the truck and drove home and watered his herd that night for the first time in 7 months on cold, sweet aquifer water that did not taste of municipal hydrant. By the end of August 1979, Walter Hutchinson had sold 142,000 gallons of cistern water to 38 separate neighbors at 4 cents a gallon. The total receipts were $5,680. He put $940 of that money back into the mason jar under the third floorboard of the back porch, the exact sum he had spent on the 3 wells in 1970 and 1971, and the remaining $4,740 he carried in cash to the Mapleton State Bank on the morning of September 4th, 1979, and deposited in a passbook account in his grandson's name with the notation, "For the well," when it's his. He told no one. He kept a green ledger book of his own through that summer, the 7th in the line that had begun in 1923. He wrote down every gallon. He wrote down every name. He wrote down the date and the price, and beside each entry he wrote the depth of that buyer's old well, and the date in 1970 they had sold it to the company, and the price they had been paid. He did not show the ledger to anyone. He did not write a word of judgment in its pages. He simply wrote the numbers down, because his father had taught him in 1934 that a man who cannot account for his water cannot account for his life. And Walter Hutchinson had been an accounting man for 67 years before he was anything else. The rains came back in 1980 at 28.4 inches. They came back stronger in 1981 at 33.1 inches. The static water table along Route 14 climbed 22 feet between October 1979 and June 1982. The Northern Iowa Coal and Industrial Company never reopened its Sumner County operation. The men who had sold their wells in 1970 dug new ones at their own expense between 1980 and 1983 at $11 to $14 a foot on a regional aquifer that had been irreversibly damaged but not destroyed. Walter Hutchinson kept his cistern open at 4 cents a gallon for as long as anyone needed it. And then he closed the spigot, and then he never charged again. Annie died in the spring of 1981. He buried her at the back 40, under a fieldstone 12 feet south of the third wellhead, and he did not get another dog. Walter Hutchinson died in November of 1989 at the age of 86, in his own bed, of a stroke that took him in the early hours of the morning. The 1934 aquifer map was folded in quarters in the inside pocket of his canvas work jacket on the chair beside the bed. The mason jar under the third floorboard still held $940 in 20s. In the spring of 1995, his grandson, 36 years old, came up the back 40 in a faded canvas work jacket and Wranglers and brown work boots, with the original 1934 hand-drawn aquifer map folded in quarters in his right hand. The third wellhead was capped against the weather under a wooden housing the old man had built in 1981. The brass spigot at the south face of the cistern was still there. The grandson opened the housing. He primed the line. He turned the spigot, the water came out cold. If you have ever stood in a field everyone else gave up on, subscribe to the old man's field. We tell these stories because some knowledge only proves itself slowly, and the right ear is the only thing that ever finds it. Some knowledge doesn't get louder when the world doubts it. It just waits.